Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Welcome to a pre-recorded conversation about a work from 2012 by Adrian Piper as time-based art between myself, Manuel Arturo Abreu, and philosopher Darla Migan. This talk is hosted by the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art as part of the programming for the Time-Based Art 2020 Festival. Thanks all for being here. I'm going to let Darla introduce herself now.
Hi, I'm Darla Migan, and I'm an emerging critic based in New York City. And I have just completed my dissertation on Adrian Piper's oeuvre, both her art and philosophy, titled Orienting Authentic Judgements, Adrian Piper's Contributions to Black Aesthetics. My most recent criticism has been published in the Brooklyn Rail, on the gallery show in New York City. The Brooklyn Rail article title review is Brown's a Color, Black is Not.
Thank you so much for being here, Darla. For those who don't know, my name is Manuel Arturo Abreu. I'm a poet and artist from the Bronx. I've been in Portland since 2009. I got my bachelor's in linguistics at Reed College in Portland. Since 2015, myself and Victoria Anne Reis, a Dutch heritage white woman, co-founded and have been co-running a free pop-up art school called Homeschool. We create welcoming context for critical engagement with contemporary art in a genre-nonconforming multimedia edutainment curriculum. We're currently in our 5th year. I want to thank all of the funding bodies, regionally and nationally, that have made the programming possible. Everything is free and online. As long as YouTube is around, it's going to be online at homeschoolpdx.tumblr.com. And today we're going to talk about a 2012 work by Adrian Piper. I first understood it as emerging in the MoMA retrospective show. I'm not sure if it existed before that, probably did, but I also understand it as coming out of deep institutional trauma. And so in this work, we see Piper with a kind of blue-gray skin tone on her face and a reddish tint in her hair, her eyes, her teeth. And she has a declaration at the bottom of the text. Yeah, there's a kind of implicit desire for me to not show any of her work. I know that there's some of it is freely available, but there's also a lot of bureaucratic processes around showing the work. So to honor that, I kind of think we just should describe stuff in words rather than show it.
Okay, absolutely. I totally agree. And I did pick this work in particular because it is available for free online, which also I think is in part important to how to interpret and how to think about it. And it is not only is it a work that's free and available online, it's also part of the archive, the online version of the archive, and it's part of the news available about the archive. So it's not only just a work of art, it's actually also in a certain framing of it, is not only an artwork, but it's also news about the artist.
Right.
And I say that and I mean like things along the lines of like things about the artist who is also a philosopher named Adrian Piper, because her, let's say, announcement of a symposium on her book, Rationality and the Structure of the Self, is available also as a news item, as is the announcement of her Venice Biennale win, the Golden Lion. I think that was 2015. The most recent news is of her taking pictures of herself during COVID, figuring out how to tie her mask around her face. So things that are just like really mundane are in that same format of being the news along with this piece. Or this page, we could call it, without referring to like, without starting the interpretation that like this is a web page on the adrianpiper.com, the archive, her foundation archive. Nothing is by accident. She is a first generation conceptual artist who takes any material that's available is definitely a materialization of the art idea. So just kind of using like first generation conceptual art talk. Anything that we experience through our senses is absolutely there on purpose. And I think it's also important to distinguish between the text that's underneath the framing of the news and then the text that's embedded onto the image.
To speak to Darla's point, adrianpiper.com/news_sept_2012.html houses this primary context for this work. It's kind of a rolling news component of her archive. And in September 2012, she posted this work that we're describing. And the caption for the piece itself says, Adrian Piper has decided to retire from being Black. In the future, for professional utility, you may wish to refer to her as the artist formerly known as African American. So that's the caption for the image itself, which, as I said before, has Piper with a kind of bluish or grayish tinge to her skin tone, which is normally very light. And she's got a kind of reddish tinge on her hair, which is cropped close to the head. She's got pearl earrings. There's a bit of a reddish tinge to the whites of her eyes and the whites of her teeth. She's wearing a sort of navy blue vest or sweater. And the caption, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And the caption included in the image, so distinct from the caption in the news roll of the image, about the image, this text is included at the bottom of the frame. It says in white Courier New font, "Dear friends, for my 64th birthday, I've decided to change my racial and nationality designations. Henceforth, my new racial designation will be neither Black nor white, but rather 6.25% gray, honoring my 1/16th African heritage, and my new nationality designation will be not African American, but rather Anglo-German American, reflecting my preponderantly English and German ancestry. Please join me in celebrating this exciting new adventure in pointless administrative precision and futile institutional control. Signed, Adrian M.S. Piper, 20th of September, 2012.
It was something you said that made me think about the way that the photograph or the portrait that we see here in the piece is a manipulation of the photograph that we see in the reconstructed Wikipedia page. So Wikipedia had a biography of Adrian Piper available, like any other Wikipedia page. She wrote to Wikipedia and told them that it was not factual. And so you can also search for, we could do this together. Just look up Adrian Piper reconstructed wiki. She wrote her own wiki for her biography. So it's important to my reading of the piece that the same page that she reconstructed uses this portrait that's in the artwork that we're discussing.
Yeah, they have some administrative rules around the person the page is about can't submit stuff and have it cited as personal correspondence. Like it has to go through an academic source or something,
Oh,
or a
that's
published
interesting.
interview with a digital platform or something like that.
Right. So I guess I'm not sure what, if any, attempts were made there, how they went. But to my understanding, Dr. Piper just was not happy with, or just thought that there were factual errors, specifically, not just that she wasn't happy with, that there were factual errors in her biography, and then now offers this one as a sort of official biography that it looks sort of like the Wikipedia page, like that you would normally pull up. Her biography exists in a lot of different places. It exists in the Escape to Berlin book. It exists as part of the archival material for the retrospective, both in its, on MoMA, on the website for the institution that hosted the retrospective. It exists on her website in a different form, in a much more extended form with footnotes. She also has for one of the longest CVs that I've come across, professional CVs that includes all of her work in philosophy. I think it's important to note that her relationship to maintaining her archive is a big piece of how I think I've come to understand the urgencies of her art and her philosophy. So needing to, or feeling driven to need to literally go to the lengths of getting the permits to situate the building in the part of Berlin where that archive is housed, going to like administrative court to get the right licensing for that building, to maintain it in perpetuity, and then continuing to maintain a certain kind of administrative oversight so that it could potentially go on, I think speaks to a level of ongoing level of like both professional and personal fear about erasure that I think needs to inform our reading as well here. Yeah, so just I'm thinking not only about withdrawals from the space of her being a first generation conceptual artist, so withdrawals from the institution, withdrawals of, you know, a certain kind of identity, but withdrawals that also speak to a kind of anticipating speaking back to erasure. So yeah.
It's a perception of false information or pseudo-rationality, as you might call it. Like there are so many sites or contexts that are plagued by these pseudo-rational maneuvers, you know, and they threaten to erase her and destroy her. And so she's dealing with a huge mob of co-conspirators, possibly, if you take her perspective fully, right? I think it makes complete sense on a systemic level. I don't know the individual actors, but to tie it to, you know, for example, we have assigned a reading for those who are interested in watching this. We suggest reading Adrian Piper's essay, Passing for White, Passing for Black, in which she discusses the concept of passing, Black people passing for white, such as in our own family, but also the kind of monstrosity in white people's minds of imagining themselves being Black or having some Black ancestry, right? Which by the one drop rule of the United States would make them, in some people's minds, Black, right? And so the idea would be that in her work, race is a kind of special case of a larger set of issues, I think, which I think of it as pseudo-rationality, right? Rationalizations of our conceptual schema in the face of produced or perceived anomalies that threaten the cogency of that schema, of that scheme. So, you know, her work in and of itself threatens to be reduced to just being about race, which is a big problem I find in the historicization of her practice. But yeah, go ahead, sorry.
And even reducing, you know, the to performativity, I think, which ends up happening as a celebration of her work as a kind of early performance artist. I think it's just wrong. But getting under an understanding of what is meant, I guess, first by theoretical anomaly. So just to kind of unpack a little bit about what pseudo-rationality is, I would say just in kind of plain language to think about what is necessary for the coherence of our belief systems. And so many beliefs that we have are perhaps wrong, but they help get us through the day. Then there are perhaps even more salient beliefs that are wrong, but actually help not only get us through the day, but help us understand how the world is constructed. And when those beliefs are challenged, the thinking goes, Dr. Piper's thinking goes, when those beliefs that not only just get us through the day, but the beliefs that help us to understand the coherence of the world itself, when those beliefs are challenged, we are prone to acting in ways that she calls pseudo-rational. So ways that are going to then maintain the coherence, not only of our day-to-day beliefs, but the coherence of the world itself. So one of the examples of this is race, and race is a way to make sense of how the world works in modernity. I have, in my own interpretations of her work, tried to do something very strange, which I probably shouldn't say on TV, but I'm very interested in perhaps doing and haven't finished the project. I think it's like the part 1 is my dissertation, part 2 is yet to come, and part 3 is certainly out there as well. But I have made an attempt, Manuel, to think about perhaps squaring Kant and Foucault with Piper. So what oftentimes gets referred to as a kind of psychologization of Kant by Piper, I think that's wrong too. But in fact, she's, I think Dermot Costello is the one who taught me this, like, is an agnostic about the conceptual scheme, the difference between conceptual scheme and what might be certain kinds of stimulations in the world. The visual capacity of race is not only visual, right, but the ways in which race is visual are just this kind of stimulation in the world that will get built up into something that looks real or that gets talked about as real or is treated as real. And Dr. Piper has, in her essay, Passing for White, Passing for Black, given us a kind of both so personal and professional breakdown of what it's like when people encounter her visually and have their own, not just again beliefs, but conceptual schemas threatened by her presence, in that she has been taken for white, and for a long time in her life, for a very long time, would announce to people that she in fact was Black. And she gives us a whole rendition of like how that came to be, growing up in a neighborhood. She grew up in Harlem and went to prep schools in Manhattan. So she says, in Passing White for Passing for Black, her schoolmates would have been upper to upper middle class, upper middle class white students, classmates, and then at home, playmates would be phenotypically visible Black working class playmates. And so she moved between these worlds, and she says that she was alienated in both of these worlds. So I would venture to say that her interest insofar her interest in thinking about conceptual schema from her training as a Kantian, race becomes an example of a really salient phenomena of ways in which people are triggered perhaps into using pseudo-rationality. And that happens and is evidenced by their reaction to her when they say, you can't be white and you can't be Black. And where does that leave her? And I don't want to get too deep into like what the ontological sort of unfolding of that is, but I personally care about that. And so all I'll say about that is that I feel like the work that she's doing artistically is perhaps investigations that are not met by the work that she's doing philosophically.
Interesting. I see that, but I also see some degree of continuity, or rather, I think that understanding her philosophical practice more, as well as I would even venture her yoga practice more, helps me and maybe other people understand her art practice more. For example, it's allowed me to understand a deeper continuity from like the cartographical systems work of the late 60s, thinking of like Utah Manhattan Transfer 68 or something. And this idea of space as medium being rendered through these kind of Cartesian abstractions of two-dimensional planes. But then going from that into kind of using her body as a site to understand these Cartesianisms, the way that these schemas use space as a medium to execute power or execute unequal social dynamics, or the kind of stereotyping that's involved in understanding self, right? Like I was struck, I still have to make my way through her books, obviously the 2-volume recent works, but the parts that the limited parts that I have read, I was really struck by this idea of the honorific stereotype in the construction of the self, that certain aspects of our conceptual schema that beg the question of pseudo-rationality or kind of cajole pseudo-rationality are these propositions that bolster up our self-esteem or something, like this honorific stereotype of self or this narrativized heroic sense of self or something. And we suffer shame and embarrassment when these things are questioned, right? When an anomaly presents itself or is perceived to exist in the context. So what I see in her work is the generativity of producing and systematizing these anomalies, right? Whether it's in these kind of very dry conceptual map type works, or whether it's in this use of her body as a nexus or as a node for creating these anomalous encounters.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's absolutely continuity in the oeuvre, in the artistic oeuvre for sure. What I'm always hesitant about, and really do try to listen to her when she tells us, to not perhaps jump to making correlations between her artistic practice and her philosophical research. And I think there are really strong reasons for that. One of them being that we should read a lot more Kant, perhaps, and follow her own intellectual history out of just, kind of a certain kind of intellectual sort of responsibility before we start making. But I agree with you insofar as like in the artistic oeuvre, if we were to move from the early conceptual work, or even back from the beginning of the retrospective, what we see at the beginning of the retrospective is that she started out as a painter, and she's doing works in experimenting with LSD, and like at some points in the retrospective reader, which I have here. She talks about being just kind of like a child of the 60s, like a hippie in the 60s, and like being someone who's also, you know, simultaneously interested in like Renaissance musicology by the time she's in college. That's her major. So someone who really has a wide breadth of interest. And yeah, I want to encourage the humility around all of the many different disciplines that she participates in and has become known for contributing to. But definitely in the artistic oeuvre, I think going back to the early conceptual art is absolutely necessary for understanding the work that begins to involve the body and appearances of her own body in that work. And I think Uri McMillan actually does a really wonderful job in embodied avatars in the section that he writes on Dr. Piper but for understanding what is performative about pieces like Mythic Being, but are nonetheless part of a trajectory, you know, still in line with, I think, those the pieces where she's mapping, she's using graph paper, she's thinking about, you know, daily activities, you know, noting the phenomena of, you know, her experience in the world in this kind of Cartesian way, as you're saying, right? Like, what locates space and time? My body, rather than my body is out here performing in some attempt to gain attention. She's always worried about that. She's really concerned about the ways in which performance art is spoken of, not to denigrate it, but I think she thinks it's misunderstood, and that insofar as performance art is misunderstood, what she's doing as a conceptual artist is even more so, because she's not unfamiliar with happenings, and she's living in New York in this period of time and making conceptual work, although not yet with the body, not until about the 70s. But I think maybe that was a really nice way to kind of get back to, since we're talking about the use of the body again, or into it now, what's happening in the piece. It's important to kind of like give it a little bit more than just what we see on the website. I think just in terms of precedents, absolutely cornered. I think Mythic Being, which I've already mentioned. Well, even if we just think about those two, a certain kind of self-fashioning comes to mind, which is, to my mind, is part of how we should be reading this withdrawal from Blackness, or this retirement, and specifically retirement, right? It's a term that's meant to refer to labor and the end of giving one's labor over to what is essentially white supremacist capitalist system of her participation both in the art world as well as in academic institutions writ large. And she's been in a lot of them, and she continues to be in a lot of them, right? And this piece doesn't happen and end her relationships to like really huge, big time institutions that continue to identify their participants racially. Maybe we could start from Cornered, because I love that piece so much. I don't have a script for it in front of me, but it does start out, as you say, she's like, it's a very sort of, Jeremy Purcell calls it twin set and pearls. It's like Martha Nussbaum.
Martha Nussbaum, exactly, yeah.
But in this very sort of staid, completely non-confrontational tone of voice, states, I'm Black. How are we going to deal with that? And it immediately gets described, or by our critics, as being confrontational. And I think this is for me, primary example of that kind of stimulation of disrupting others' conceptual schemas. And she's perhaps doing so in a way that is intended to be, the least confrontational, in order to show how deeply embedded race is in our conceptual schema. So in our understanding of ourselves, we are so deeply invested in race that it's this question over like, why are we even still talking about whether race is real? But the question really isn't, more interestingly, the question is, how is race real? Rather than biologically, we've disproven that there's any sort of consistent measure of race. It's so deeply embedded still, this should strike us as being counterintuitive, perhaps, that race is so deeply embedded that even overturning a kind of biological foundation for race doesn't disrupt its reality in our social functioning, and not only in our social functioning, but in our self-understanding. And that tone, that quiet announcement that she's Black, and that tone being read as confrontational by white art critics, I think is primary, is like just the most efficient way of showing how deeply embedded race is for our conceptual schemas or for our self-understanding. So then what happens when she's doing it in the other direction, right? So the early 80s is when Cornered is from. So here we are with Thwarted Project, Dashed Hopes, A Moment of Embarrassment, approximately 30 odd years later, and she's telling us that she's retiring from Blackness. For me, so when you asked me if I wanted to do this conversation, I was like, what happens between that announcement, I'm Black, and this 30 odd years later? Did she stop being Black? Can one stop being Black? I think the first reaction I had to the 2012 piece of Thwarted was, can I stop being Black, or is that just for her? Who can stop being Black? And to what extent does this have to be performance? Insofar, right? So we're back to this question, right? But I will keep telling myself and keep reminding myself, but I had to do it even here again, that this is not performance art, this is conceptual art. And to the extent that there are performative elements at work in the conceptual art, that is for the manifestation of the art idea. So maybe we could, like, what is the art idea that's even happening here?
Totally,
I always just kind of keep going back to, like, what is this first generation conceptual artist doing?
I think that something about the idea of a pointless exercise in administrative control, it's kind of one of the aesthetic propositions of the work, right?
I feel like we got the suggestion that it's gray, like from the gray, the 6.25% gray. But I wonder if it doesn't seem brown. Like, I had to really ask myself,
Look.
like, did she just tell me that it was gray? And then I was like, it's gray?
And then maybe the blue is from the sweater, you're saying?
Right.
And there is a bit of a redness to the blue-gray skin tone as well. It's hard to say. I mean, the color it could be described in a number of ways. Gray, purple, red, blue, all of these are involved.
And
Orange.
this is important too, right? She says in Passing for White, Passing for Black, where is this? I have perhaps a different pagination, but she says, we see in this history of the classifying terms, she's talking about race, variously used to designate those brought as slaves to this country and their offspring, first Blacks, then darkies, then Negroes, then colored people, then Blacks again, then Afro-Americans, then people of color, now African-Americans. Why is it that we can't seem to get it right once and for all? The reason, I think, is that it doesn't really matter what term we use to designate those who have inferior and disadvantaged status, because whatever term is still used will eventually turn into a term of derision and disparagement by virtue of its reference to those who are derided and disparaged. And so will need to be discarded for an unsullied one. My personal favorite, that's where I was getting to. This is still paper. My personal favorite is Colored because of its syntactical simplicity and aesthetic connotations. So whatever color you see, have at it.
Right, it's a kind of aesthetic project. I think is kind of the point. And maybe that's why it's pointless, right? Because it's so tied to aesthetics. And as we move out of this biocentric model of race into a more contemporary, I don't know, like hyper-real or speculative model that kind of generalizes market conditions, I think we're seeing like the idea of property and race, right? Race as tied to the construction of the idea of property, right? Like in your very astute lectures on Cheryl Harris. If we're thinking of this kind of contemporary model of race as commodity or difference as commodity, then it moving away from the biocentric into this aesthetic, it actually deepens anti-blackness and colorism, right? So when you're asking like, who can choose to retire from blackness? Obviously not dark-skinned people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not
It
all
comes to
dark-skinned
my
people. I mean, dark-skinned Indian, like Carnatic people,
mhm.
they don't have to identify with blackness. So there's
Right.
other considerations in how these delineations are made when you're,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, seeing this shift from biocentric to, I guess, aesthetic.
And
Or,
I thought about it. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited about this question. I think, can Kanye retire from blackness? Did Prince retire from blackness? There's a very specific allusion to Prince's retirement from his own name in order to get out from underneath the exploitation of his labor, which is also black music, which is also freedom music, which is also funk music, which is also fun music, which is also everybody's music, right? But to get out from under the name that he had given himself, right? Not the slave name, but the name that he had taken on, which was then reappropriated back by Warner Brothers. The Harvard Law Review essay by Cheryl I. Harris, Whiteness is Property, has been really influential for me right now and recently, and I've been reading it recently. And, you know, her example of the post-racial moment, which is approximately around the time, you know, this piece is being made in 2012, there's still a discourse of like, well, we're in a post-racial moment with once President Obama is elected. Nobody's talking about that now. And then this is also the same year that Piper's making Thwarted project. She will make a piece in honor of Trayvon Martin. Can Trayvon Martin retire for being Black? I don't think so. Absolutely not. I can't think of that particular murder of that child as one that could ever be disentangled from the racial project. So who and when and where retirement from blackness is possible is what is absolutely being provoked here. So it's less of a concern, right? Whether and who and which, you know, sort of art world elites and the elites that Adrian Piper shares institutional space with. I think it's like much less interesting what their reactions are to the language in the piece than to what it provokes about the world beyond those institutions that aren't being rhetorically, like for those who aren't able to rhetorically manipulate them or comment on them.
right, because the construction of the construction of presence for Piper, it's a combination of visual and linguistic material, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in and of itself, it's a kind of schema. It's a system, as a networked property to it, because it's always her appearance in conjunction with her speech, or a card that she gives out, or some other
Mm-hmm.
linguistic gesture, right? And that's pretty distinct from someone who cannot escape from the visual tyranny of white supremacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the linking of like dehumanization to specific textures and features and skin colors.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question of like, as interesting as it is, this whole thing of like, you know, let's just say his name, Willard Van Orman Quine, right? When he tells Piper
It's
class
like
orientation, the new student orientation, yeah.
mm-hmm.
And she had applied as Black. And so the kind of one of the most preeminent analytic philosophers, Quine, at the reception comes up to her, having read her application, presumably having issues with affirmative action or something like this. Said to her, well, Miss Piper, you're about as Black as I am. And she responds very kind of coolly, oh, I didn't know that about you. To kind of point back to him like, well, what are you trying to say, right? And so for her, it's this very tenuous moment, and it does speak, you know. So on the one hand, it's interesting that there's this whole history of like analytic philosophy as tied to pseudo rationality and the, you know, the honorific stereotypes that these white men have to prop up to feel good about themselves and get through their days, and how that kind of mars their projects so much. And that's good. I mean, I'm interested in that because I am interested in analytic philosophy, but then there's still this question of the same mechanisms that are playing out in this linguistic visual nexus that Piper inhabits or constructs to present herself. It plays out as well for dark skinned people. It's just, it doesn't have to involve linguistics at all. It's just visual. Um, so I disagree with the idea that Piper's is a special case or something, or that she herself is an anomaly. That,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I understand that there is this specific social experience of whites withdrawing the welcoming that they might have extended to her based on her phenotype.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand
What?
that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
sorry.
I think what's interesting, that I think you're right. She's not, it doesn't, let's say, how does it matter that she has had time to comment on her experience rather than no longer being able to offer it to us because she's been terrorized to the point of non-existence into non-existence. I think it's important that we know her class background, that we understand that she was moving between a working class Black neighborhood and upper class schooling, because there was time to develop a kind of dialectical relationship between like, why am I feeling alienated between these two places, rather than never having left the Harlem neighborhood where she was being raised, or having entered the prep school arena where she was, you know, acculturated in the context of upper class white people. So yeah, it matters to me insofar as she's traveled and was able to travel and continues to be able to travel. So even say when she went to Germany for the first time, I can't remember, I think it's in Escape to Berlin, but she talks about how as a young student traveling in Germany for the first time, before she opened her mouth, people thought that she was Turkish, right? So, and you had just mentioned like dark-skinned South Asian people not being racialized as Black or in the context of hypodescent, right? So where she's able to travel both within the United States as well as outside of it, as not tracking hypodescent, as not being the kind that drags her hypodescent, or her hypodescent is not necessarily right on the surface. I would suggest that she buys herself time to think in that space, and time to think about how to give to gaze back, and in many ways to gaze back, both in her quip to Quine as well as in the piece that we're looking at here. This is like a Mona Lisa bent here on the head, right? I love this. Like, she's hilarious too. I think we shouldn't forget to talk about the humor in her
Absolutely.
work. She seems, it is a tool of survival that is recognizable. She mentions a work. She mentions a comedian in the Passing for White, Passing for Black piece. Was it Eddie Murphy? Where she's talking about the person who whites up their face and then gets on the bus, and it's all white people on the bus. And then when they get off, so he whites up his face, and then there's one Black person, visibly Black person on the bus. When that Black person gets off the bus driver cracks champagne, and everybody's chilling, everybody's hanging out. It's a good old time. And she uses this example, right, to talk about the ways in which the party ends when she announces her Blackness to people. All of a sudden, it's like, we were having a good old time. Like, why did you have to bring that up? Like, you know, as if she herself wasn't even part of the announcement. She just brought Blackness into the room. Whereas before, they had been having a good time. It's like, why are you messing up the party? And there's a bravery, a courageousness there that I feel like she's just, this is moral courage, right? Like, you can pass, you've been raised, but you've also been raised in a part of the branch of the family that doesn't pass. And when she applies to Harvard, right, she's thinking about, her parents tell her that this is like the one time, like, don't do it. She's like, don't check the box that you're African American, and she does, and she's like, I'm not going to pass. But what we come to learn through that essay is that what I also bring the Cheryl Harris piece, Whiteness is Property, back to in that context is like, even if you didn't check the box African American, like all the ways in which her relationship to Harvard could be read as legacy, could be read as not yet belonging, in terms of wealth privilege, right? Nothing is clear cut. And so it wouldn't be a clear cut example of merit either, had she not checked the box. And then merit, then we have to investigate how merit also is a kind of pseudo rationality that we use to hold the world together, to make sense of why those at the top are at the top and those at the bottom are at the bottom. without investigating race. And here we are back again, through Cheryl Harris's essay, investigating the inheritance of Black codes on up through de jure, de facto segregation, on up through redlining and segregation and access to mortgages and loans, and on and on and on and on. So where is this merit that Adrian Piper would have been claiming anyway?
Her parents, I think she says that they always said what they meant and stuff like this, things that are not in accord with the way the world works. So there was an anomaly there when she had the, as you're saying, disconnect between her home life and her schooling life. Not only the racial distinctions and the class distinctions, but also this aspect of her nuclear unit said what they meant, what they said, upheld their promises, etc. Lived in her mind in an ethical way and raised her dotingly as an only child, etc. I know that, I still have to make my way through Escape to Berlin, but there's a part where she says on page 267, to go back to the work that we're discussing, the science on the fictitiousness of the concept of race is over a century old, but to treat it as an article of faith that one is free to reject is to lose touch with reality. So, this is a biographical book. I'm assuming that she's speaking sincerely here. So the retirement in this work, it must correspond with the conceptual gesture that involves performativity and involves the kind of systemic analysis that has been ongoing in her practice, right? So she doesn't believe it's possible to retire from race, because to treat race as an article of faith that one is free to reject is to lose touch with reality. I mean, that's a direct quote. That, maybe I can be accused of reading too much into, but from that I read that in this work there is the kind of Piperian political gesture happening, right? Where her body can kind of stand in for a network of relations and a network of power constructs and linguistic constructs. And so yeah, we can maybe discuss what the visual aspect is. Like, she's drawn to this idea of colored as the term that most describes the weirdness of the American situation, from which Berlin is kind of set up as an escape because Europe sees people more in terms of nationality or something, right? But so what are the kind of somatic effects of this, whatever filter she's using, or the gestures that went into altering this reconstructed Wikipedia photo, right? In that it whatever we call it, whatever the color is, it still is a visual darkening of
Oh yeah, absolutely.
tone, of skin tone.
And it seems, we might even ask, why not just make the announcement? What is the image even? What's the purpose of the image in relationship to the news framing, or the present to herself, which I also find interesting. Like that whole, like all of the language is really something I spent a lot of time with. I think it's still not clear to me why the image looks the way it does. But maybe I can accept that, and insofar as it's none of my business why the image looks the way it does. What I do recognize is someone naming themselves, and insofar as not even just not performing, naming, saying that I, Adrian Piper, who is 64 years old, and we can confirm this by the actual date of her birthday, as reported in several different places, a lot in all of the biographical places one looks. Adrian Piper's birthday really is on September 30th. So we're really talking about this person. This is another correspondence with Cornered, where not only was the announcement made that she was Black, but also, although they were duplicates, I learned, but there were the 2 birth certificates that were issued to her grandmother for her father, one saying white, and the next that her grandmother went back for, I believe, reading Octoroon.
Right.
And so this is a replaying of an old scene of demarcating you are the linguist here. So what is this doing when you say, I'm going to index myself to myself for the purposes of doing something that would explode reality? I'm going to index myself in ways that go back to every time I've ever announced that I was Black. And starting from the street corner when the kid was like, you sure do look white, right? And give me a quarter. And that's every single time in her whole entire life, right? That she had had previously announced. Is she renouncing? And it doesn't seem like that would be possible. So like that impossibility of renouncing one's Blackness, not just not being able to not be Black or something like that, but to be unable to maintain a coherent world system, a whole experience of not only self but world through that retirement, but then also indexing it to oneself. The frustration should be ours. So insofar as I don't know what the visual is meant to communicate to me, other than it doesn't matter what what I look like, your world should be disrupted just as much as mine is. In maintaining those institutional controls. And why haven't they been? And why do this piece now after announcing that she was Black in all the circumstances that would have been professionally, that she says, would have been professionally beneficial to me? It's really important to me that this is also this post-Obama, post-racial moment where, we could see up to today that claiming an identity, a racialized identity, does have professional benefits, while it also maintains its credibility as criminalizable and available for exploitation, hyper-exploitation, and immediate death upon sight. This is someone who, as a scholar of her own experience, is telling us this is dangerous to maintain a kind of institutional upholding of race for the purposes of what it is going to, I think what I'm reading and excited to unpack is authorization of more Black death. This is what post-racialism has done for you. You're able to, some of us, dark skin, light skin, move in institutions like the one that's hosting us now, in the context of ongoing hyper-criminalization and availability of Black death, right, to the state. And I don't know that she could, I guess there are many ways to say that. But when I think, certainly, I guess I won't name names, but like a certain kind of disdain for her in the context of this piece, or disdain for her, like outright, like I'm done with Adrian Piper because she has announced that she's not Black anymore. I'm so disappointed in the lack of thinking that's happening there.
Well, I think we should accept that Piper, in her long trajectory and in her awareness of some of the changes in terms of intra-racial trends around people that exist in her positionality, I think she's anticipating and even excited about those kinds of reactions too, right? As they speak to the times changing.
I really just meant the manipulation of the image that we see. Like, I don't know enough about Photoshop or about like why the image appears the way it does, rather than what the image tells me about her racial designation. So I think those are important, right? Like it looks as if some manipulation has occurred, from the photo that we see in the reconstructed biography. When I say it's none of your business, I really just mean like, I'm not sure I'm prepared or would venture to correlate what's being said in the piece, like the language in the piece, to the image. And I think that's the point. Like whatever manipulation is happening, rather than something like, is she blacking up? That has its own history. I think that it makes sense to me why that just, I've heard it before. I've heard that come up before in the description of this piece. Like, it did not occur to me that that's what she was doing. I think all she is doing is manipulating how she appears. That's what I mean by like, it's like none of our business, like what is happening like in that visual appearance. It's more interesting to me that like the image appears. It could be, okay, another way to think of it is like what's happening in mythic being. Are you convinced that this is a man or some kind of gendered like maleness is being performed?
Are you convinced that he's Black too?
Right, like this is not effectively performing anything on a spectrum of gender in my estimation of that piece. And it took several turns. Like it was, you know, the mustache wasn't there in the beginning, the wig changed, and none of the, as far as I understand it, like none of the iterations of mythic being as it grew, as the piece grew, as the piece went on, ever reached some kind of like successful passing. And I really wanted to bring the passing for white, passing for Black piece here because it never worked, right? However which way she attempted to tell people that she was Black, it was a failure on some front, one front or another, either for herself personally, for her, the group dynamic, the social situation she was in. And it never, let's say, whatever fix there was, even with the calling card, for example, it has to be done every single time. There is no sort of like reaching one's equilibrium for social context that doesn't somehow become ostensibly like confusing for others and disheartening and yeah, depressing. Yeah, so I'm just thinking like that's what I meant by it doesn't matter what the image looks like in its manipulation, because the point is that it will always fail. Like one will always like it will always race will always fail. So whatever one is saying about race, there is not some kind of accurate image that would correspond with whatever one is saying about race, whether one's talking about retiring for Blackness or not.
And I think the difficult thing and part of the kind of misogynoir that she's facing is that people, like you said, they fail to understand her as a first generation conceptual artist, like someone driven to avoid the work of subjectivity. But in this case, paradoxically, by introducing her body and subjectivity as the art object, right, as the site for this network of relations that are aesthetic or cartographic. They're not, their materiality comes through this interpretive or aesthetic process of encounter, right? It's a networked process. And so she's offering her as a site for that. The work isn't about her in that sense at all. I think a lot of people try to misread her work as being about her and her racial experience. And yeah, I almost did that with her philosophy as well. I was more just saying that I understand her work better and some of the continuity historically by reading the philosophy more. And I think it also helps people move out of this idea of Adrian Piper as an artist about race, because it's very wrong, you know?
Yeah. I would
And
like
so,
to
yeah,
endeavor to teach her. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to like parse through, to have a class to actually, because there was no class in my PhD education offered on Adrian Piper in what is now about a 10-20 year subfield of critical philosophy of race. I don't know of any neo-Kantian scholars teaching Piper in the United States. Right, so, and it needs to be done. So, I mean, critical philosophy of race and thinking about Kant's racism is, yeah, I mean, what can I say? Not huge in Kant scholarship, but there is a contingent of people. I was invited to a wonderful conference in Munich on Kant's anthropology. There were, full, true lovers, like readers of Kant, like readers of the full system, people who read the anthropology as closely as they read the first critique, the critique of pure reason, who I then got into great conversations with. It was a great conference. I had a really good time, actually. And those are the people who are friends with Dr. Piper in Germany. And those Kant scholars, because I don't want to start talking shit about Kant scholars in America, but yes. there are more comprehensive readers of Kant who are excited by comprehensive readers of Kant, of what, you know, of whom she is one. So there are people who are really excited. And I think that, you know, to the credit of, you know, some people, Paul Guyer, like there was a symposium. She does have emerita status at the APA, the American Philosophical Association. You know, they've retired her, given her, you know, just like she's alive, she's still here. Anyway, I'm not prepared to teach the first volume in any way. I'm just not trained at all to do like thinking about decision theory and proofs and logic on decision theory and Humean uptake of, you know, Anglo-American scholarship, Anglo scholarship. And that's the first volume, is like clearing the ground for the possibility of thinking about a coherent system. We won't say complete system, but coherent system. That's her inheritance from Kant. But I want to keep reading and I'd love to keep reading and have people to read with. So absolutely.
If we're thinking about genealogy in terms of scholarship, she's also kind of pointing to the geographic and paradigmatic areas that she elaborates on in her work, right? Like Anglo analytic philosophy, Germanic philosophy. So
that's interesting. Yeah.
there's something happening there, and I think that in my mind, it ties to these two levels of caption. Like in the news roll caption, she says she retired from being Black, and then she makes the Prince reference, and then in the image text, she says she's got like the kind of racial mathematics going on, and there's a more specific evocation of places that she's moving from and toward. She didn't say Black, she says African American. And African, she says 6.25% African.
Gray.
And for dads or gray, sorry.
Oh, to
in
reference
recognition
her
of,
African ancestry.
Yeah. So, you know, because her dad's an octoroon, so that's 12.5, I believe, etc. So she's got half of that. Whether that comes from a DNA test or whether it comes from, again, like you mentioned, where she shows the two birth certificates her grandma acquired. One says her dad's white, one says her dad's an octoroon. It's an interesting question. Like, did this math come from one of these companies that treats race and geographic origin and haplogroup as a commodity for people to kind of have this curious experience with, like, ooh, I'm this percent this.
No, it's really fast. I mean, I'm hearing you speak as a analytically trained philosopher now too. Like but simultaneously also trying to psychologize like why these numbers matter to her, or why discovering the truth of one's nationality. Like I really do not.
I don't know that they do matter to her. I think they're supposed to matter to us, maybe, like you said.
Right. Well, they're meant to trigger some sense of like disconnect, or having misread her, something like that. She does admit, however, to being obsessed with these like ancestry.com studies. And I don't know what that means to her, what she does with that information necessarily, but I try not to, I try not to, you know, I mean, it's meant to be funny too, right? Like giving these sort of like hard facts and what the hard facts might mean. The hard facts probably, if you synthesize them correctly, they mean something like 6.25% gray when it refers to her Africanness. So you've misunderstood something about how to do the math correctly. Your math is wrong. When you call me African American, right? So it's the reference to African American identity that's being called to question in the repudiation of the institution. So it is almost like the repudiation of the institution of what is African American. I think if I'm understanding this correctly, it feels more like the reference to being called African American is merely a reference to hypodescent, where she's like, hypodescent describes nothing other than pathology.
Describes the fear of white people being themselves, by the logic of hypodescent, Black.
Right. So, and so then for me, they just like unpack so much about what work needs to be done beyond accounting for reparation, let's say accounting for the material and economic sort of maintenance of generations of exploitation. Like even the way, like even if there were to be some appropriate accounting for reparations, you would still have to do the work of dismantling your conceptual scheme. You would still have to do the work of dismantling what it means to be recognizable as an American, or referred to, or being able to refer to oneself as an American. Given that we, you know, this is like our problem, like she says in Cornered, how are we going to deal with it? Our problem here in the United States is hypodescent, is the problem of hypodescent being positioned as an African American identity. And it just isn't work that I see being done, right? I mean, or insofar as one can have a variety of phenotypes and participate in Blackness, where is the questioning of how one participates in hypodescent? I haven't really thought about that too much yet, but it seems there's like whatever calls are being made to recognize, or let's say overturn or uprise against white supremacy, would seem to also require attention to I should just go back to what she says, right? Like exploring the idea of Blackness in oneself. Yes, okay. It's a sentence that starts, among politically committed and enlightened whites. I'll read from Dr. Piper. Okay, among politically committed and enlightened whites, the inability to acknowledge their probable African ancestry is the last outpost of racism. It is the litmus test that separates those who have the courage of their convictions from those who merely subscribe to them. And that measures the depth of our dependence on a presumed superiority of any kind. Anything will do to other human beings, anyone, anywhere, to bolster our fragile self-worth.
Yep. And this same argument, of course, doesn't just apply to predominantly European people. It applies to people that have, sometimes a great significant degree of African ancestry. Dominican Republic, great example. Our most genocidal, dictatorial president, the dictator Rafael Trujillo, installed by the U.S. Marines. He had a Haitian grandmother, right? Dark-skinned Haitian grandmother, and he hated Haitian people, hated dark-skinned people, hated Afro-Dominican people. So this same argument, I think, depending on geographic context and time and the paradigms of thought, it can apply to different types of mixes of suprematists, I guess you could say. Because mixed supremacy and white supremacy have a relationship as well.
It seems, it occurred to me rereading this essay, reading Passing for White, Passing for Black, if part of understanding like racial hatred, hatred of racialized people is that one knows deep down that this is my family. These are my ancestors, connected to your ancestors. I love the pull quotes that Dr. Piper uses about people discovering their ancestry has like some missing places in it. And even if it doesn't say, so-and-so was raped, right? People know that if that person is missing, that ancestor is missing, what it indicates, what that black invisibility indicates about themselves, or what it indicates about what they would require to not know about themselves in order to know themselves, what they would be required to not know about themselves in order to maintain the understanding. I'm trying to use my Popperian vocabulary, maintain the self-understanding. It's really painful, right? So it's not just read all the books white fragility, and then you get some Audre Lorde, and then you like pat yourself on the back, do a couple laps on the marches. You know, it's really some, and I've seen a few memes like that, right? This is work that would have to require your full like self-annihilation, right? That it would have to actually be work that would make you so vulnerable that you couldn't possibly understand what it would mean to be able to move anymore, and you'd be paralyzed by way of having a self-worth and self-esteem that wasn't directly tied to the subordination of others. Is to have no self at all for so many people. And then, yeah, so there's all kinds of existential psychology that we could go into, or not, but it seems like the first place to start, it seems like this is bare minimum, right? In terms of understanding how to transform the world that we're living in, is to recognize in oneself how one is obliterated by the possibility of self-recognition. Because you need self-esteem, you got to have it. What would self-esteem look like without the subordination of others? I don't know who's leading that learning group, but it's not me.
Yeah, and you know, this other concept of like this reconnection process of people who have shared ancestors, and but what shares them is violence and sexual abuse and stuff. And the gesture of reconciliation here, I think, is really interesting, and her distrust toward their kind of openness and joviality around it, I think, is really interesting. Like, she's very alarmed and confused by the way that they welcome her, you know?
Right. The older, yeah, the white branches of her family that were passing, yes,
Yeah.
or that pass. Right. It struck me like that the alienation continues from Black working class people, and this is something just like that I have experienced. So maybe going back to like what you were saying earlier, this is not about a phenotype happening here. This kind of alienation is happening in the context of being accused of being white. Like, I'm really dark, but being accused of being white by virtue of educating myself, right? So taking on a certain kind of privileged role in relationship to education lends itself all too quickly to all new forms of alienation. And I think, yeah, maybe that's what you're getting at before, but it seems to me, I don't know why I've felt the need to say this to people, right? This is also something, right? Experiencing alienation in the context of being either in the academy or outside of it, and finding pleasure. I think this is where I see myself in Piper. I see myself like, you know, attaching myself to her, is that there's still pleasure in reading alone, right? That I'm still like, if nothing else, if I was too dark then and I'm too smart now, that there is still joy in connecting my story to her story that feels really pleasurable and hopeful even, and then also allows me to rejuvenate in ways that you know, keep the heart wide, and be able to go back to the street and be able to walk down the street and use my own voice in whatever way I see fit. And I want to encourage more people. I have a hard time encouraging, you know, anyone to go into philosophy. Like, that just happened by accident for me, but it just to read and to find oneself and one's voice and find strength in one's voice. Like, you know, she talks about the cousin that tried to like use a working class vernacular, and then that person is like married to somebody who was like a WASP from Iowa. It's just like all kinds of perpetual, ongoing, like generational, perpetual pathologizing of others and self. Like, I'm just more interested in like breaking out of cycles like that, or at least recognizing them, or at least trying to recognize them, rather than saving the pseudo-rational at all costs. That's where I think we get into a lot of trouble. All of us can get into a lot of trouble. Like, and I see it happening, to be perfectly honest, right? I see it happening in the sort of embrace of an identity politics that would have one believe that one's superior to one's white counterparts in a what is, you know, I mean, this is a different area branch of philosophy, but kind of like mere reversal of, you know, supremacist thinking, which is actually, once again, a repetition of the same thinking. And it's, I mean, it's really difficult for me to talk about, and I don't actually, I choose not to talk about it because I think it's coming from a place of pain, and it's coming from a place of needing to rectify wrongs that are so huge and so gargantuan, that are so beyond one's capacities, but then not wanting to have to admit to what is beyond one's capacities after having been told what's beyond one's capacities is real. The alternative to that, right, is I think recognizing a certain human limitation in that, in everyone. But it's why, yeah, I don't know, it's why I don't just work on thinking about Black artists or artists who identify as Black, and a short-sightedness that comes from that kind of reversal is at play there. And I don't know, but maybe next year I'll just be like, I can't do this anymore. I actually just need to do all Black people next year. So like,
You can go back and forth. You don't
yeah,
have to choose. Yeah.
the rhythms for sure. And the rhythms are complicated rhythms, right? It's like, that's, I mean, that is also something I've learned from Dr. Piper, right? So there are a lot of philosophers who have no idea what she does in her artwork. They're just really confused. They really don't want to know, and vice versa, right? And artists who will never take the time or have the time or find it meaningful to read Hume, like, it's not gonna happen. And she has to be at peace with that. And I have actually really no understanding of her yoga practice beyond a couple of articles, but I feel like the first task, or my first task, I prioritized trying to understand the system, her philosophical system, more yeah, in more depth than I have to this point. But I'm really curious, like, who are the Piperian yoga scholars? Like, who are the people reading and studying and thinking and sharing and translating and teaching what she's learned through her yoga practice?
Since the 70s, by the way. She's been at it for a very long time.
Yeah, a very long time. Yeah. And it's deepening, and she's really excited to share the news of the progress of her practice there. And I don't know. I mean, she has, I think, her own crew, her own people that she's been practicing with for a very long time as well. But I'm not familiar. I read a really interesting piece, like it also was biographical in nature, like she was talking about the different withdrawals, which I was reading kind of like through the lens of like the history of conceptual art. Like, I was so annoyed with I'm not even say his name, like, I'm like, how far does this get? But like, Thomas Chatterton Williams, like, describing this list of withdrawals, right, like as if they were all kind of on the same plane, of like her withdrawing from eating meat on the same plane as her withdrawing from being Black, and just really reductively describing her as this kind of like someone who's addicted to withdrawing, so much so that it kind of lands her in this place of, what else can I withdraw from, right? It's really not, well, that's what people write when they write about really long-term practices in a very cursory way, in a very short-term way. But it struck me that she became, she is like I don't know, protecting herself is important. Like, to think about how that is still part, like, in her limitations, like some of where I think I'm okay with understanding that a lot, or some part of her work is about self-preservation, which ultimately is also what pseudo-rationality is about. And so she is also participating. And then, I mean, I guess the next step, once, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing this anytime soon, but the next step is to think through her system in a reflexive way, to try to understand ways in which Adrian Piper is not, translucent to herself, right? She's not able to recognize, ways in which the practices maintain, or many of her perhaps artistic practices, even, like, there's the piece where I can't remember what it's called, where she's holding on to like all of her like hair droppings and like fingernail clippings, and like there's, I think MoMA owns this piece, like into, as like for as long as she lives, like there she'll always be sending like parts of her body like as it's decomposing, I guess, like in to belong to join the other parts, like so all of her toenails and fingernails are like collected in one place. I don't know how relevant that is, but more just like, I don't know, a certain kind, like I'm just curious to think through like what kinds of pseudo rationalities might be in play in her attempt to also preserve herself in the face of the amazing work that she's doing.
I'm really thinking about this kind of conceptual devotion to like exhausting the permutations of a given idea within a set of constraints, right? As taught to her by Sol LeWitt, and how this, when you put the body into that context, it gestures to the impossibility, because there's as many permutations as there are people and perspectives, right? So when your body is being used to talk about space as a medium for power and for these kinds of pseudological constructs, it maybe points to a paradox about how can that be exhausted, right? And I think this ties to the retirement gesture. Like, how do you exhaust the different permutations within the set of constraints, which are Piper's appearance and her linguistic gestures about her racial identity, right? Whichever way they go. So I'm thinking back to what you said about getting out of repetition, like repetition and settled identity ties to convenience, right? Of course, and it ties to these pseudo rational schema. Like we move through the day, we have these honorific stereotypes of ourselves, we etc. Wake up and keep doing it. And I haven't tied this thought to the next one yet, but the main thing I'm thinking about is how it ties to Kant, right? So like there's a kind of absurdity to the devotion to deontology, to like finding these intersubjective rules, even as there's also the heroic impulse to continue to focus on the limitations of the human aesthetic perspective, the mind itself, space and time as a priori, etc. Like these are really important limitations that we need to be discussing, whether it's in the special subtext of race or just in a more general context. But I think also the absurdity of the rule is that we can see how it's embodied in hypodescent, which this piece kind of speaks to, right? Like there's hypodescent as rule is Kantian in a sense, and it ties to Kant's racism as well. But how do we square that with this heroic focus on human limitations, right? And maybe specifically, how does that tie to this kind of devotion to avoiding subjectivity in the work, but then using the body itself as the object to exhaust permutations of an idea within a given set of constraints, right? So I'm just basically agreeing that she's brilliant, and I'm really grateful for this conversation. And
the as if of the of aesthetic judgment is where I go there. So this is not Piper at all. This is Darla now. Why keep proposing where the rule's gone awry? The rule as that which is going to determine or make it possible to think, to know rationality, to be aware of the difference between instinct and like that which stimulates reactions and pseudo-rationality. We're testing, so this is the like unsociable sociability of testing out a hermeneutic for freedom. So testing out ways in which there's like keep practicing, the species will keep practicing rules in order to achieve and to finally arrive at the telos of freedom, right? Maybe not even this material species, right? But it is a practice for life. It's a practice for faith in the possibility of freedom. We're not anywhere close to it. It's not for us to know how far along we are on that. Testing, right? for where peace might be. It really requires a lot of faith for me to do that. I mean, this is, it is definitely like rational faith, but it is a rational faith. and one for me that requires doing that empirical work, which I should read Hume, like doing the empirical work that will go awry because the testers, like those who are arranging the test, are unaware of the conditions of the testing that they're doing. But that's, it's dangerous work. A lot of people are, a lot of mismanagement is happening in setting up the possibility for finding the rule that would allow us to know freedom. Mismanagement is like, that's the Foucauldian part, right? Like, I don't think Piper would go that route at all, but that's me trying to think about where judgment is even, I don't know, could be recognizable as authentic. It's like we have to go materially. We have to take the material route because we are material creatures who are looking for a rule of rationality. Whether or not that even is, possible is even like secondary to whether or not it's a fiction for survival already. Like, she's not going to take that route, right? That's not Piper. That's me. But if I'm getting this right, like for her, moral courage is all that's required for recognition of bad judgments.
She would even maybe say that logical moral claims, should be enough to change people's judgments and behavior. And that's the ultimate Kantian ideology. So I don't agree with that. I much more agree with you and governmentality and the social construction of rule, tying into how our brains work. Like, we need to have this fantasy of rule, for me, especially in the language context, grammar. And it's a fantasy. I mean, it's arbitrary stuff. It's about us being human, and it shows that our imperfections kind of guide our path, right? We're not, that's Kantian as well. I mean, we're guided by these imperfect aesthetic a prioris, right?
But it's third critique, not first critique, right? Like, that's the piece that she would, I don't know. I mean, one day I hope I can ask Dr. Piper about the third critique, but anyone who's trying to do like work in continental, European content, German and French continental philosophy, and coming at her with some aesthetic judgment, she's not having it. She's an Anglo-analytic Kantian scholar, so through and through. It's really interesting. It's really fascinating, like how her art is so much celebrated by those who've done art theory and been, trained up in thinking through the radicality of like, postmodernism, and then just like, you can do that, but like the conceptual whole remains. Like, you're welcome to do whatever you'd like, but the revelation, like, I wouldn't use such theological terminology, but like, rationality is what you need. Like, you can go off and do these experiments in art, but oh, this is great. Yeah, I'm really excited to just keep doing my work, because I have now a variety of tasks that I'm doing in the world, but like, especially having your class with homeschool has been really, it's not just a plug for homeschool, like I'm advertising for you now, but I am, because it's been able to help me ground myself in work that I want to continue to do, that I don't have a community for at the moment, but I'm hoping to like gather some philosophers up, and now that I'm back in the city.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. That was a conversation between Darla Migan, a philosopher, and myself on Adrian Piper's 2012 work, Thwarted Project, Stashed Hopes, A Moment of Embarrassment, from 2012.